日本海事協会の平
I
田で
am
ございま
Hirata
す。
from Class NK.
本日は皆様
Let
お
me
忙
greet
しい
you
中ご
via
参加いただ
video
きまし
today
て
as
誠
I
にあ
have
りがと
other
うございま
engagements
す。
to attend to.
2020年よりカ
Thank
ー
you
ボン
very
トラ
much
スト
for
との
taking
共
time
催
out of
で
your
シリー
busy
ズ開
schedule
催
to
しており
join us
ます。
today.
ネット
Since
ゼロ関連
2020,
のウ
we
ェ
have
ビナ
been
ーですが、
hosting a webinar
今回
series
で
on
第
net
6回
zero
目と
with
なり
Carbon
ます。
Trust, and this is the
第
sixth
1回の
in
ネ
the
ットゼロと
series.
カーボンニュートラル
Since the
以
first
降、
webinar,
一
which
貫し
was on
て
net
ネ
zero
ット
and
ゼロ
carbon
達成に向け
neutrality,
て
we
企
have
業
been
や金融機関に
consistently
求めら
focusing
れ
on
る
the
環
issues
境情報
of
開示と
information
目標設
disclosure
定につ
and
いて
target setting
TCFD、
required of
SBT、
companies and financial
TCAF、
institutions to
サステ
achieve
ナブル
net
金
zero
融、タクソノ
emissions.
ミーなど
The webinars
テ
have
ーマにい
focused
ろんな
on
テーマに焦
themes
点を当て
such as
て海外の専
TCFD,
門家を交えて開催
SBT,
してまいりました。
TCAF, sustainable finance and
今回
taxonomy,
は
and have
カ
been
ーボンニュー
held
トラル認証と
inviting
カーボンフット
overseas
プリントに焦点を
experts.
当て、
The
バ
focus
リュー
this
チェーン
time
全
is
体で
on
のネッ
carbon
トゼロ
neutral
達成が叫ばれる
certification and
中、
carbon
ますます
footprinting,
その算定の
especially
標準
scope
化と
3
飛躍
footprint,
的削
which
減
is
が求められてお
increasingly
ります
required to
ス
be
コープ3のフッ
standardized
トプ
and
リントとカー
drastically
ボンニュートラル
reduced
認証の有
amid
効な使い
calls
方につ
for
い
the
て
entire
欧
value
州の事
chain
例
to
をご紹
achieve
介したい
net
と思い
zero
ます。
carbon emissions.
ま
We'll
た、
also
そ
focus
れ
on
に
the
関連
effective
し
use
て
of
経
carbon
済
neutral
産業省様
certification
の進められ
through a
る
presentation
GX
introducing
リーグ基
examples
本
from
構想
Europe.
における
A
カーボンニュ
presentation
ート
will
ラル
also
認証、
review domestic
カーボンプライシン
developments
グ、
such as carbon
カーボンク
neutral
レジット市場な
certification,
どの
carbon
国内
pricing,
動
and
向につい
carbon
ても
credit
レビューして
markets
まいり
under
ま
the
す。
GX League concept promoted by the
今
Ministry
年
of
3月に
Economy,
公表されま
Trade
し
and
た
Industry.
IPCC 第
Since the
6次
publication
評
of
価
the
報告書総合
IPCC's
報告書で
special
は
report on the
ネット
Paris
ゼロ達
Agreement's
成のために
1.5
今まで以
degrees
上に
target
積
in
極的な
2018, achieving net
GHG
zero
排出
emissions
量
by
削減
2050 has
と
become
そ
an
の目標
urgent
設定の
issue.
必要が言われ
And
ております。
IPCC6
本
assessment
日のウェ
synthesis
ビナーで
report
もこの
published
よう
in
な
March this
目
year calls
目
for more
まぐ
aggressive
るしく
GHG
変化する
emissions
状況につい
reductions
て
and target
皆
setting
様
to
の理解
achieve
の
net
一つと
zero
なれば
emissions.
幸
I
いで
hope
す。
that today's webinar will
これ
help
ま
you
でも多く
understand
の
this
皆様にご視聴
rapidly
いただき、
changing
ネット
situation.
ゼロに関
We
す
are
る
very
最新の
pleased
情
that
報を
so
皆
many
様
of
と
you
共
have
有できてい
watched
るこ
the
とを大変
series
嬉
so
しく感
far
じておりま
and
す。
that we have been able to
簡単では
share
ご
the
ざいま
latest
すが、
information
ご
on
参
net
加いた
zero
だいて
with
いる
you.
皆様に
I'd like
感
to
謝いた
thank
し
you
ますと
all
と
for
も
your
に、開
participation.
会の挨拶と返させていただきます。では、司会の岩渕へ
Now,
戻
I
し
would
ます。
like to hand
よろしくお
over
願いします。
to the MC,
平
Mr.
田部長、ありがとう
Iwabuchi.
ござい
Thank
ま
you
し
very
た。
much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Yamaguchi from Kensei Corporation. Carbon neutral certification and carbon footprint is today's topic. This was also the topic of the first webinar we had in 2020. At the beginning of this year, I received some inquiries about the carbon neutral certifications for the supply chain. So I thought we'd like to have a webinar under this topic again and planned today's seminar. Today's content. First, I will give a presentation on carbon credits and Scope 3 calculations. Then Silvana and Hugh from Carbon Trust London will discuss today's main topic, carbon neutral certification and carbon footprint, followed by Mr. Honda from Class NK presenting how carbon neutral certifications, credits, and such are dealt with in Japan's GX League. This is a chronological table showing global trends in environmental information disclosure focusing on climate change. I prepared this table for the last webinar. The table was well received, so I will show this table once again. At the very left is a history of climate change information disclosure. Credits relevant to carbon neutrality became widely recognized after the Kyoto Protocol. In the 2000s, cap and trades were actively practiced. Then, at the time of the 2015 Paris Agreement, SBT was launched, and in 2018, in response to IPCC's 1.5 degrees Celsius special report, the net zero movement emerged, and the ideas of the credits have also been discussed under the movement. While it is not specifically today's topic, there's another major trend, environmental information disclosure, such as CDP, followed by CDSP, TCFD, and today, ISSB as a unified move. There are other topics that I'm tempted to touch upon, but I will refrain from doing so today. Here's the outline of my presentation. I'd like to do a recap of the history of the credits after the Kyoto Protocol. Next, I will show what kinds of credits emerged in the net zero context. Then, the Scope 3 calculation, as Scope 3 is attracting attention these days. These are the types of credits under the cap and trades that started with the Kyoto Protocol. The projects among the developed countries are called joint implementation projects. A credit from those projects are ERUs, emission reduction units. Then the credit from the developed and developing countries is CER, or certified emission reduction. The mechanism of which is called CDM, or Clean Development Mechanism. And the emission rights are assigned to countries, and countries with unused allowances sell AAUs, assigned amount units, to the countries and companies in need. In the latter half of the 2000s, many transactions, especially under CDM, took place. This is the mechanisms of the cap and trade under the Kyoto Protocol. Allowances assigned to countries and certain entities are registered at the UN, and credits from CDM or JI will be registered at the registry. So the UN was both a certification and registration body under this credit scheme. This slide is about the recent situation of the credits after that rough categorization. In addition to the UN certifying scheme, there are such credits like JCM, which are bilateral. Domestically, for example, in Japan, METI and Ministry of Environment have been operating J-credit scheme. There also are voluntary credits led by the private sector. The examples shown on the slide are from Mizuho's information. There are more of the such voluntary schemes. Those credits are basically from credited certified reduction from energy saving projects. Next, let us cover the credits concerning SBT and net zero. Starting from the SBT initiative, it is expanding rapidly. Already, nearly 5,000 companies have made commitments. More than 2,000 targets have been validated. In response to the IPCC recommendation in 2019, targeted settings that are stricter than 2 degrees Celsius, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and less than 1.5 degrees were introduced. Later, SBTs were divided into near-term and long-term targets, and in principle, our target setting is now to be in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. Today, 5 to 10-year targets has replaced the original SBTs, and there is a long-term SBTs for net zero. There also are SBTs for SMEs, commitment for 1.5 degrees Celsius, SBTs for financial industries, and so forth. But at this moment, there are only 227 companies that were verified with net zero standards. Responding to the IPCC recommendation, in 2019, the target setting in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway has started. Conventional targets became 5 to 10 years near-term targets. For the longer-term targets, target setting toward net zero is required. Emissions reduction throughout the value chain is to be aimed at. Beyond value chain mitigation means, as the name suggests, mitigating actions outside the company's value chain. Neutralization means the neutralization of the residual emissions at the time of the achievement of the long-term target through such means as removal-type credits. To look into more detail, I think looking at the roles of credits would be helpful. The orange line of the chart shows the emission level, assuming business as usual. With the reduction measures like renewable energy, energy saving, and such, the emission level goes down to the yellow line. So that is a yellow line. The dark blue portion between the red line and yellow line is the reduction achieved through energy efficiency and such efficiency improvement. This is the reduced amount with efforts toward net zero. In this chart, in the year 2050, the target year for the net zero, there still is about 10% remaining. With removal type projects outside the value chain, meaning by using, for example, CCS or DUC, or by using credits obtained through investing in such activities, neutralization is accepted in the net zero. net zero requires becoming carbon neutral by 2050. So basically, the priority should be to reduce rather than to remove as much as possible as own initiatives in the value chain. So that is a priority. And then residual emissions are to be neutralized with the reduction type credits reducing the outside. And so avoidance portion cannot be recognized as credits. Avoidance is needed to be done within the value chain to be counted for the net zero. That is the major difference against other credit types. We just looked at the difference between the carbon neutral credits and net zero projects. I'd like to move on to the Scope 3 calculations. This chart shows the number of companies that responded to CDP, which I work for in my different capacity. I have presented this information so many times already, and looking at numbers from last year, 18,700 companies have responded, accounting for about half of the global market cap. When this started in 2003, the number of companies that responded was just about 200. So it increased nearly 100 times in the past 2 decades. Last year's figure was 13,000, so there was another significant increase. In 2008, the supply chain program started. When we look at Japanese companies, the number was 1,700 in 2022, growing substantially from 900 in 2021. This is because, as the prime section of the Tokyo Stock Exchange started, the investor requests increased from 500 to 1,800. I'd like to give a recap of the CDP supply chain program. Member companies, major purchasing companies, would give information requests to CDP, and then CDP would request the suppliers to disclose information. CDP would provide various support for the response, and the results would be put together and analyzed. The performance of the suppliers would be reported to the member companies, leading to a higher level of supplier engagement. CDP is also promoting primary data acquisition from the suppliers so that the member companies can make Scope 3 calculations. This shows a change in the number of supply chain companies that responded. In the first year of 2008, the number was just about 630, and the number of the member companies that made the request was just 16. Then last year, 280 member companies sent requests to about 40,000 supply chain companies. More than 16,000 companies responded. As a value chain-wide achievement of net zero is required, the necessity of supplier engagement came to be highly appreciated. This slide shows the number of companies that responded to the requests from investors and those responded under the supply chain program. I mentioned earlier that in 2022, 18,700 companies responded. Out of that, a little less than 4,000 responded to the investors' requests. On the other hand, 16,400 responded under the supply chain program. When you add up, the number would be more than 20,000. This means that there is an overlap. About 17,000 companies responded to both requests. In increasing the responses to CDP requests, the supply chain program plays a much bigger role. Now, a recap of Scope 1, 2, and 3, referring to the material on the Ministry of the Environment webpage. First, Scope 1 is the direct emissions of the business from its economic activities, such as burning fuel. It is calculated by the emission factor of the fuel and the amount of the fuel used. Scope 2 is emission from the supplied electricity or heat. Scope 3 is indirect emission outside of Scope 1 and 2 related to economic activities, meaning emission from supply chain, emission from the customer's use of the products, and such. For Scope 3, the flow of economic activities including the production of products and services to waste disposal, was categorized by the GHG Protocol into 15 categories. Here, in terms of the life cycle of the products, what are most important are purchased goods and services, or Category 1, leading to upstream transportation and distribution, or Category 4, and then use of sold products, or Category 11, and then end-of-life treatment of sold products, or Category 12. Other than that, emissions related to capital goods, leased assets, waste disposal, business travel, and such are included. Different from Scope 1 and 2, standard calculation methodologies have yet to be established. So, with the approximation, material elements are to be determined, and for the calculation of the material elements, efforts are needed to improve the accuracy of data. This is a chart of the 2020 CDP Supply Chain Report. This shows the scale of the supply chain emissions compared to Scope 1 and 2. The figures are the ratio. The average ratio of supply chain emissions against Scope 1 and 2 emissions is 11.4x throughout the industries. The ratios vary among different industries. When we look at retail industries, which sells products supplied by many products and distributors, the supply chain emissions are 28 times larger than the emissions from the companies of the sector themselves. We can say that to achieve the net zero throughout the value chain, the reduction of supply chain emission is quite essential. Now I'd like to discuss the calculation methods for the upstream categories of 1 and 2. Here, the emissions amount is calculated by multiplying the activity volume by the emission factor. The values for the activity volume here would be the volume of the goods and services sold, or the sales value. The most general practice is to use the emission factor from the input-output table described in the top. In the case of the EDIA database provided on the Ministry of the Environment webpage, in addition to the IO table, energy statistics, industrial statistics, and various dynamic statistics are used. Therefore, while the IO table is constructed based on the company's activities, there are quite detailed and specific figures for each product and service. So the emissions factors are mostly based on the volumes. The challenge is that it takes significant time before the figures become available, while the IO table cycles are fairly long. Next is the LCA-like approach. LCA stands for life cycle analysis. So calculations based on the inventory alone are called life cycle inventory. Although the IDEA database is based on the input-output table mentioned earlier, because it provides emission factors for individual products on an intensity basis, it can also be called LCI, or life cycle inventory. LCA analysis is to calculate emissions from raw material production to delivery of goods and services in a more individual manner. In the CDP supply chain, the emissions factor is calculated by dividing the supplier's emissions by its sales based on the information reported by the supplier. The emissions factor is then multiplied by the sales value to calculate the emissions of the company. And so this approach is also widely used. For suppliers that do not report their emissions, CDP often uses the average figures, specifically the median in many cases of the emissions per unit of sales by sector, to calculate emission amount. Under the CDP supply chain program, suppliers may also provide numbers as allocations as a primary data they measure. This is what is written on the far right. In many cases, it is common to prepare Scope 3 by collecting data according to the availability and importance of the data, measuring emission factors, looking at the stability of the average as such, and combining methodologies in a comprehensive manner, which is called hybrid. Now, I'd like to move forward and talk about the Scope 3 calculation and the offset by products. First, regarding the 4 methodologies for Scope 3 that I mentioned, I'd like to talk about their strengths and weaknesses. First, the strengths of using LCI data based on the IO table. For almost all of the goods and services, emissions factors can be applied so that it is optimal for grasping the overall picture of Scope 3. Also, calculations are done not for the industry, but for each product and service, so the impacts from forex and price changes can be excluded. The weakness is that, as already mentioned, fairly old statistical data are used, and since the values are fixed, emissions reduction made by recent technological development is not reflected. Also, efforts made by individual suppliers would not be reflected. If, by collaborating with suppliers, the LCA-like emission amount covering cradle to gate can be calculated, it gives the most accurate results reflecting the reality. But obtaining accurate data would require time and cost. So one way of doing is to use the LCA-like approach only to the area of the largest impact. The third approach is to use data from CDP or other supplier reports to calculate suppliers' sales intensity. Primary data, such as allocation figures directly from suppliers, would be used. This approach will reflect the most recent efforts of each supplier. Also, there's no need to conduct research for Scope 3 calculation like in the LCA-like method. So the additional cost is not needed. This approach is commonly used. However, since it is using a sales intensity, the results are affected by exchange rates and price fluctuations. This may be a weakness. The methodology using the industrial average or the median is at the bottom, light pink portion. Regarding the suppliers for which the emission amounts are not reported, some kinds of estimated figures are needed to be used. If the industrial classification is not done in a detailed manner in terms of products, the sectoral average would include various products. Taking an average of products with different natures may not quite reflect reality. This may be a shortfall. So again, fully recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of different methodologies and depending on the level of importance, Scope 3 calculation is done in a hybrid manner. I think that summarizes the general practice of the day. Through supplier engagement, reducing supplier reduction jointly to aim at net zero is what the supplier program is about. For Scope 3 calculation, data are captured at a company level or at the production unit level within the companies. Industrial averages are also primarily taken at the production activity level by the business types. So this is the calculation based on activities. There also is an LCA-like approach or the calculation based on products. In this approach, inventory data is obtained from emissions from the production, transportation, and distribution of raw materials for each product. Basically, the emission factor for each product is derived in units of volume, so there is the advantage of being less sensitive to price fluctuations and foreign exchange rates. The starting point for today's discussion was to offset emissions in the supply chain with credits to assure carbon neutrality, achieving the neutrality with credits dealing with the raw materials. However, as I mentioned earlier, for companies aiming for net zero in the entire value chain, the challenge remains that the offset by credits will not be reflected in the net zero unless they are removal types. But still, as long as the credit market is valid, they can be at least eligible for carbon neutral certification. I believe that selling products produced with such raw materials can help companies improve their company's image and such. I'd like to leave the specifics of carbon neutral certifications to Silvana-san and Hugh-san. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
山口様、ありがとうございました。そ
Thank
れで
you
はこ
very
こで
much,
カーボントラストを
Yamaguchi-san.
ヒューさんと
Now,
シルバーナさんよりご
Silvana
講演
and
いただきたい
Hugh
と思
will
いま
give us
す。
a
ヒューさ
presentation
ん、
from
シルバーナ
Carbon
さんよろし
Trust.
くお願いします。
Hugh, Silvana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hugh Jones, and I'm the Managing Director of Business Services in the Carbon Trust. And shortly you will hear from my colleague Silvana Centi, who is an Associate Director in the same business. And we're going to give you an overview today, starting with the background of the Carbon Trust, and then talking more specifically about the label, about net zero, and about carbon neutral. Next slide, please. So as you can see from this slide, the Carbon Trust is as well as being a mission-driven organization with our mission to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future, we're also a global organization. We have offices around the world, although predominantly based still in London in the United Kingdom. And most importantly of all, we now have over 400 expert consultants, which gives us a really deep insight into issues around climate change, carbon, energy, and sustainability. And we've been focused entirely on this for over 20 years. So we're one of the most experienced specialist firms in the world. Thank you. And as you can see from the next slide, you can see our work is being divided into a number of areas. For example, strategy, reporting and delivery for businesses, but also assurance and labeling, which we will talk about today. So that covers not just setting target for net zero, but also achieving decarbonization and making claims which are backed up by assurance. And then we also work broadly in market transformation, where we look to accelerate areas of technology such as offshore wind or heat decarbonization. And we work increasingly with green finance as a way of further accelerating the move to a decarbonized future. And here are some examples of organizations around the world who we are proud to call our clients. What we have found is that leading companies in all industrial sectors are keen to be leaders in sustainability and climate change. So we're able to work right across all different sectors, and you can see a range of those represented there. Thank you. So I'm going to talk now, starting to talk about the technical part of the discussion about net zero and carbon neutral. So we're going to start with a explanation of net zero. So very simply, net zero is about the transition and the trajectory to a decarbonized future. And net zero is two things at its heart. Firstly, it is a reduction by a strong trajectory of emissions between now and approximately the middle of the century. So that's the first part. And then the second part is that once an organization or a country has reduced its emissions by around 90% by the middle of the century, there will be 10% residual emissions. These are things which are impossible to eradicate, for example, industrial processes or maybe long distance heavy goods transport, and those emissions will still be there. So those will be neutralized with carbon dioxide removals or greenhouse gas removals at that point. So two stages. One is very steep reductions of around 90% of from where people are today in terms of emissions, and then at the end, which is normally 2050, it will be removing and neutralizing the remaining emissions by having removal offsets, and that constitutes net zero. Some organizations say they will be net zero by 2040, which is an even steeper reduction, and others by 2060, which is a less steep reduction, but it's the same principle. And the important thing is that this is absolutely key. Organizations, governments, they need to prioritize decarbonization in order to get to net zero. They have to have 90% decarbonized by the middle of the century. Offsetting is the very last part, and that only takes place at the end. So that's the key thing to remember about net zero. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we talked about the reduction, and then we talked about the neutralization. So what is the kind of neutralization or offsetting which is needed for net zero? And I should say the net zero rules are governed by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So they have a very good website, actually. So it's a very easy place to check online what the rules are. So there are 3 types of offset which are acceptable for net zero, and it's important to note that these are all removal offsets. They're not avoidance, they're removal. They actually withdraw CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere. The 3 types are biological, such as planting, growing and maintaining forests, restoring peatlands, wetlands, and other nature-based solutions. The second type are what we call hybrid, which is a combination of nature and technology. So good examples of those will be biochar, or another one would be bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, known as BECCS. And then the third type is entirely engineered. So examples of that would be direct air capture or carbon dioxide cured concrete. Now, it's important to note that all of these, and particularly the engineered ones, they are not yet ready. They are being developed. There is investment going into them. And the hope is that by the time we get to the 2040s and possibly even the 2030s, they will be available at scale and at an affordable price. But for now, those are under development. The nature-based ones, yes, I mean, you can see that obviously those are present, but these removal offsets are quite difficult to achieve. So if I grow a forest, I have to be able to prove that that forest has sequestered carbon over time, and only once that time has passed can the offsets be available. So deforestation has to be happening in the past or now for the removal offsets to be available in the future. So those are broadly the removal offsets recommended by the Science Based Targets Initiative, which will be eligible for net zero. And remember, for net zero, this is to offset just the remaining emissions after you have reduced 90% of them. So this is what you will need in 2050, sometimes 2040, 2060. Next slide, please. So that's net zero. That's the big one, the one that we recommend. The second area, which is sometimes confused, is carbon neutral. And carbon neutral is very, very different. Carbon neutral is not to do with a trajectory over time. Carbon neutral is to do with a specific point in time. So for carbon neutral, you take normally a year, and it will be a year in the past. So normally it will be the last completed year. And you say, I will work out all of the emissions for that year for my organization or for my product, or sometimes from the event that I'm running, but normally it's a product or an organization, I will work out the carbon dioxide emissions and I will calculate those. I will then go and I will purchase offsets which equal those the emissions of my product or organization, and I will use those to compensate for the emissions that I have made. So that's got nothing to do with a trajectory of reduction. It's just to do with a particular period of time, and for compensating those offsets. So that's the key difference. And frankly, if that was all we did, it wouldn't be enough, because there aren't enough offsets, and the efficacy of offsets is too dubious to just keep emitting at the rate we are and to offset everything. We will run out of room. So we have to have reduction with some offsets at the end, which is net zero. Carbon neutral, yes, it can be a useful way of investing in in good quality offsets to happen by buying them, but we recommend very strongly that it is only part of a net zero strategy. In other words, if I'm an organization and I want to make one of my products carbon neutral, I really should make sure that I, as an organization, am already on the route to net zero. And then in addition, I might make a product or my own organization carbon neutral. Some more details about carbon neutral are that there is actually, under the standard I'm going to talk about in a minute, there is a need to do some reduction, but it's not defined as strongly as it is for net zero. And then a second difference is that you can, as well as having removal offsets, which are at the moment quite rare and expensive, you can also have avoidance offsets for carbon neutral, which are easier to find, but there is an increasing controversy about how effective and genuine some of those offsets are. So organizations need to be very careful what they're investing in if they're offsetting for carbon neutrality. And sorry, just before we go to the next slide, if you just go back one, just to point out, there is a standard for carbon neutral. You can see there, it's called the PAS 2060. So net zero, the standards are set by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Carbon neutral, there is a PAS 2060. So there are rules, but there are also risks. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about the offsets for carbon neutral. Just a few more details here. So the way an avoidance offset works is basically something happens to create a benefit, and certificates are issued. Those certificates are purchased and retired, so they can only be used once. And the rules are that the event which is beneficial has to be representing additional genuine greenhouse gas emission reductions. So examples of this would be, well, I'll come on to examples in a minute, but on this slide you can see that there are also rules that the offsets have to have a permanence about them. They need to avoid leakage, which is where the CO2 reductions don't actually happen, and as I said, there can't be any double counting. They have to be in the past, so very important for nature-based solutions. The forest needs to have been there to have generated the emission reduction, and there needs to be documentation on a public registry. and the credits need to be retired in an independent and credible registry. Now, there are a big variety of offsets. There can be global offsets, local offsets, nature-based offsets, forestry offsets within that, and organizations often want to choose a type of offset which aligns with their values and perhaps their brand. And you can see at the bottom there are a number of different schemes which are currently acceptable under the PAS 2060 standard. The most well-known ones are probably Gold Standard and VCS Verra. But even they have some controversy, and there have been a lot of articles in the newspapers recently about some of the Verra VCS offsets not necessarily being well, there being some doubt as to whether the forestry reductions are genuine. Next slide, please. So you can see from here that some of the different types of offsets which exist. So, for example, the ones at the top are the less permanent ones, let's say. So, for example, you can have you can have cook stoves, you can have renewable energy, and you can have forestation, which is just where a forest is not taken away. So if a forest is maintained under the rules, that can be seen to avoid some CO2 emissions and can be recorded, counted, captured, and certified as an offset. And then you can see that there is, for example, some technology offsets such as carbon capture and storage, even without bioenergy. That's still an avoided offset. And then at the bottom there, you can see we're getting into the removals rather than the avoided offsets. So not just avoiding deforestation, but planting new forests or enhancing soil carbon. And then on the bottom right, some of the technologies we talked about in the context of net zero, such as direct air carbon capture and storage. So just to remind you, under net zero, only the removal offsets are eligible, but you don't need them until you've done the reduction. So that'll be in the middle of the century. But under carbon neutral, actually, all of those types of offsets are technically eligible. But of course, you're using them. You need them now. Carbon neutral needs to be for a time that's already passed. So hopefully that summarizes some of the types of offsets and the fact that some of them are inherently more permanent and less risky than others. And then the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a summary of the key differences that I've been explaining between carbon neutral and net zero. So you can see that the boundary, in other words, what it is that you're measuring is slightly different in that for net zero, you have to include 90% reductions for your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3. For carbon neutral, the actual basic requirement is just for scope 1 and 2. But at the Carbon Trust, we increasingly try to make the rules for us as strong as possible to try to protect our customers against accusations of greenwashing. So we strongly encourage organizations to include more of their scope 3 where possible. Secondly, for the reduction under net zero is a 1.5 degree reduction against historic, limit of historic temperature increase. Whereas for carbon neutral, there is no specific reduction target. All there is a need to make a statement with a specified carbon management plan. The level of ambition is not specified. So again, you can see that that it would be easier for a carbon neutral plan to be accused of being weak, whereas a net zero plan has to be a deep reduction. Then thirdly, the approach to residual emissions. I've just talked about that the offsets for net zero are specifically removal offsets, whereas there's a range for carbon neutral. The authority is slightly different. It's SBTi on the for net zero and the PAS standard for carbon neutral. And then finally, the reputation. Yes, net zero is seen as best in class. Carbon neutral is seen as not as strong, but if done correctly, preferably when the organization has also committed to net zero, it can be seen as beneficial. However, and we will talk about this a bit later, there is increasing scrutiny on offsets, on avoidance offsets, and on carbon neutral claims, particularly in the USA and in Europe. So we are at Carbon Trust, we are reviewing even now that part of our service, and we're encouraging organizations to get assurance on the basis of reductions rather than rather than reductions in neutrality. We're looking for them to do stronger reductions, and Silvana and I will talk a bit about that in the rest of the time. Thank you. Silvana.
Hi, thank you, Hugh. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Silvana Senti, and I'm going to talk to you today about our product footprinting and assurance services, and as well our product footprinting labeling. The focus of my next slides will be on how we provide and how we have been providing carbon neutrality to clients and about the carbon neutral label. The process to achieve neutrality, the initial process to achieve neutrality is very similar to our assurance for reductions, and neutrality is a third step in that process, which I'm hopefully going to clarify in the next few slides. So okay, so this is the process to achieve neutrality and what neutrality means. So neutrality means that the product that carries that label, that footprinting label, has measured the footprint of that product, has verified the footprint of that product, and has purchased carbon credits to offset the remaining emissions. And the Carbon Trust verifies the neutrality of products based on the PAS 2060, which is the specification to verify neutrality. It could be either product, organizational, events level. The PAS 2060, it was developed more than 10 years ago, and it is managed by the British Standard Institute. At the moment, it is the only specification to demonstrate carbon neutrality. And the process to achieve carbon neutrality, it is explained in that arrow at the bottom. First is the measurement of that footprint. Then it is the assurance, the verification of that footprint. And then this, as I said before, there is a third step, which is the verification of that neutrality through the PAS 2060, and then the use of the label to communicate that product is carbon neutral. In the Carbon Trust, as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are a mission-driven organization. Our mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. And what we like with the label and the goal of the label is to endorse that is to endorse products that are reducing, more importantly, the footprint, and it is helping us and helping all of us to achieve our mission to move to a decarbonized future. And if we go to the next slide. So what is the first step is to measure, right, the footprint of that product, and that footprinting analysis is conducted either cradle to gate or cradle to grave, and that will depend on the product. If it is a product that is incorporated into another product, that will be a cradle to gate. If it is a product that is sold to consumers as a final product, the approach will be cradle to grave. And the standards that are used to measure the footprint are either the PAS 2050, that is a standard that was developed 15 years ago or so by the Carbon Trust, together with DEFRA and variety of stakeholders from trade associations to corporates. And then we have other two standards, which is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, was developed by the World Resources Institute, and the Carbon Trust as well was part of that steering committee, and same with the ISO 14067. These standards, between them, are the only standards available to measure the footprint of products, and those standards are very similar, really. There are small differences between one and the other. And the majority of our clients, our global multinational clients, they prefer to measure the footprint either with the ISO 14067 or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol product standard, because of that international recognition, and because our standards that are used as well for other reporting within that corporation. So the first thing is to measure the footprint against either of those three standards. The second step is to verify that footprint. And in the Carbon Trust, for us to license our label, that footprint analysis can be conducted by the clients. We have a rate of clients that they conduct that footprinting analysis in-house, and or by us, by our advisory team. And to license our label, then we're required to do the assurance part of that project, because we're endorsing that with the label, we are endorsing that footprint and those reductions. So we will do that verification of that footprint and the verification of the reductions and or neutrality. So there is another team in the Carbon Trust, the Carbon Trust Assurance team, that work with corporates to verify that footprint. And during that process, we review the data, we review the calculations, we review the methodology. It's an interaction with the client, and it is a process that where we normally, during that process, we raise a lot of questions, there is clarifications until we are happy that that footprinting analysis has been performed in accordance to either or any one of the three standards that I mentioned before. During this process as well, we review and certify the reductions that has been achieved by comparing the footprint of the current year versus the footprint of the previous years to demonstrate that have been a reduction on that footprint. So for clients who like to move to neutrality, then we add another step, which is the certification of the carbon neutrality. And that neutrality is conducted by the PAS 2060. So the PAS 2060, the main requirements are first to verify the carbon footprint, which we have done in the previous step. And the second is to have a carbon management plan in place. And that's quite important for us, is the reduction. It's not only about offsetting your emissions, but it's about offsetting those emissions that you cannot not reduce, because you have a commitment and you need to demonstrate that you are reducing every year for neutrality. So we check and we review your carbon management plan, and there is a document that is called a qualifying emissions or explanatory statement that has to be made public. More details on that on the next slide. And then evidence of carbon credits. So PAS 2060 as well tell us about the carbon credits, and those carbon credits have to be of good quality. So as Hugh mentioned a few minutes ago, so the PAS 2060 already recognized a few schemes, like the Gold Standard, the VCS, or the UK Woodland Trust. But then, regardless of that, the PAS 2060 as well indicates if those schemes are not already recognized within PAS 2060, the PAS 2060 as well indicates what carbon credits need to have to be considered of good quality. They might come for other schemes that have been developed in different countries within the last few years. So those carbon credits, to be considered of good quality, they have to be additional, they have to be permanent, there is no leakage, no double counting. And then something quite important as well is that the carbon credits from carbon offset projects are only issued after are only issued after the emission reduction has taken place, and those carbon credits, they should be published in a publicly available registration process as well. So these are the criteria of PAS 2060, and as well the evidence of reductions to achieve neutrality. So as I mentioned, there is the requirement of the qualifying explanatory statement that all of our clients who achieve neutrality, they need to publish, and it is a requirement of the PAS 2060. So any organization in the world that achieve a neutrality based on the PAS 2060, they need to make sure they have this qualifying explanatory statement available. Majority of clients, they publish this document on their website. And this is a summary of the project. For example, declaration of commitment for neutrality, and that it has to be signed by a senior representative from the company. The carbon footprint breakdown should be included there as well, and the carbon management plan, right? So the targets for reductions, the plan activities that the company is planning to do to continue to demonstrate reductions, and the offsetting strategy as well, the type of credits they have purchased, the reasons of that, and the projects that are associated with that carbon credits. So once the neutrality and the full verification and assurance has been achieved, then the clients our clients are now ready to communicate those results. And then normally they communicate the results with the product footprinting label. So the product footprinting label, it is a symbol that is used either on pack or in any media channel to communicate that the product that is carry that label has measured, has certified, it is primarily as well reducing, and or it is carbon neutral. It also helps consumers to identify those products that they have an environmental credentials, and then helps consumers as well to make perhaps better purchase decisions during their shopping experience. And so if we explain you a little bit more about the label. So we have, over the years, we have done a variety of research on the label, what it means, what is the perception of a footprinting label in consumers. Unfortunately, perhaps for you, the majority of our research has been focused on Europe and North America. And so these results are focused on Europe and North America. And the last research that we conducted was in 2021. And 2/3 of consumers, they told us that they think carbon labeling is a good idea. As well, 2/3 of consumers told us that they will think positively about a brand that is reducing the footprint of their product. And 50% of consumers are likely to recommend products with a carbon label. So these are very positive results. At the moment, we are conducting another consumer research on the perceptions of the label, and we hope that research will be available within the next few weeks. So if we go into a little bit of detail, perhaps to show you a little bit more information on those answers. So one of the questions is, we ask consumers, how much or less likely are you to purchase a product that carries a label? And the results, as you can see, were higher in Italy, in Mexico, and Spain. But as you can see, overall, the results are very good for most of the countries that participated in this survey. And this is a research from 2021. And then another question we asked consumer was, how willing will you be able to pay more for a product that carries a footprinting label? And the results were higher for, again, in Italy, in Mexico, Spain, and China. And but you can see, for example, in North America or in the USA, it is more than 40%, same as here in the UK. And the other question we ask consumers, it is about, we show them the label architecture, and we ask them, what do you think? What this label communicates to you? And also we were very pleased because the majority of consumers relate the label to the validation of a product carbon footprint, the validation of a product carbon emissions, and or the validation of a product's impact on climate change. And then these are some examples. I want to show you some examples of our clients and how they communicate the carbon, the footprint of the products, and how they use carbon labeling. And something as well that I would like to highlight is because in our case, in the case of the Carbon Trust, we use international recognized standards on the footprinting side and on the assurance side. Our label and our services can be adapted to any kind of product. So we footprint and we certified products from the food and drink sector, from the ICT sector. Actually, we work very closely with Samsung and LG in Korea, and with Amazon as well, devices, primarily in the USA. And we work very closely as well with Danone and Nestle, with the headquarters in France and Switzerland. And so it is very, the standards and our label, it can be adapted to a variety of sectors because we follow international standards, and we adapt sort of the standards to the footprint, to the life cycle of that product. So here are some examples of how clients are using the products on pack in the markets. Some clients, they like to achieve that certification for the main markets. Others, they would like to achieve that certification globally. And that's the case, for example, with KitKat. We work with them at global level. And same when I'll have some examples later. Same with for example, Volvic as well. It's a global label. Yovali, it is a brand that is sold primarily in the UK, so they have done work exclusively in the UK. Wunda, it is a brand from Nestle that is focusing on Europe, so we have done Europe. But then we have, for example, Amazon devices like Kindle, Ring, and Alexa, and they have been done as well at the global level. So
Silvana, I'm sorry, we're just getting a message. We need to wrap up. So could we just show the Amazon case study, and then we'll need to finish. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So just to finish, then basically this slide. Thank you, Hugh, for letting me know. So just to finalize, in Carbon Trust, we have not only we work with Amazon to endorse the footprint of the products and use the label primarily on the devices. Products, but then also we are part of the Climate Pledge Friendly scheme. So the Carbon Trust label is recognized for the Climate Pledge Friendly, and so that means that all of our clients who have the Carbon Trust label are associated with that scheme. So when shoppers, they go through Amazon and then their products will be recognized under that scheme. So that will be easier if they are looking for sustainable products. At the moment, that scheme, it is in a few countries in Europe and in the United States, but Amazon it is planning to extend that at worldwide level. So I think you will receive as well a copy of the presentation. So here are some case studies that are self-explanatory. So I'm not going to go in the detail. And yes, that's it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. So yeah, thank you.
はい。皆さん、こんにちは。
Good afternoon, everyone.
長時間お疲れ様でございます。
Thank you very
私
much
の
for
方から
taking
は、
part.
シルバ
I
ナ
would
さん
like
補佐
to
の話を受けて、
talk about
我が国に
the
おける動
following
きとして
after
GX リ
Silvana
ー
and
グでの
Hugh,
関連動向をお話
which
し
is
させていただきます。
relevant
大きく2つのこと
trends
を
and
解説させていただ
development
きま
of
す。
GX League
最初
in
は
Japan.
GX リーグ
Roughly
の動きと
speaking,
いう
I'd
こ
like to
と、それ
talk
から
about
2つ
two
目は、
things. One is
去る5
trends
月
in the
12日に
GX
国会で
League,
成立した
and then
GX
another
推
one
進
is
法と
GX
今後の
promotion
GX の展
law
望について
that
少し
was
最後にお話をさせていただきま
enacted
す。
on May
非常に
12th.
多岐にわたる内容なんですが、
So,
お伝えしたいこととして
I'm
で
going to
すね、
cover
や
a
は
lot
り
of things,
我々
but
は
my message
官民
is
学それぞれ
is
つながっ
that
ていくしかないと、
the
非
government
常に大きな
academia
タスク
and
を
the
置き換えており
industry
ますけ
need
れ
to
ども、
work
つな
together.
がってみん
We
なで
have
やっ
a
ていくしかない
huge
というこ
task.
とが、
That's
今
why
日
we
の
have
キ
to
ーメッセージ
collaborate.
だと
But I
思いま
think
す。
this is going to be the
よろ
key
しくお願いいた
message
しま
out of
す。
my presentation
こちらは
today.
GX 推進法
So
GX リーグ
this
の
is
背景について
looking
です
at
が、
the
ちょっ
background
と
of
時間の
GX
都合で
League
飛ば
and
させて
GX
いただきます。
Promotion
後ほど
Act.
お時間があ
I'd
る
like
とき
to
にご覧
skip
いただ
this
ければ
because
と
of the
思います。
time limitation. You can turn to this later
さ
on.
て、GX リー
So
グの
now
歩み
talking
が
about
こち
the
らのスライ
history
ドで
of
出ております。
GX League.
2020年のカーボンニュート
So
ラル
in
宣言を起点にまとめ
2020,
られてい
carbon
ます。
neutrality
右
declaration
の上
was
に小さい字で
declared.
ありますけれど
And
も、
then
国際ビジ
top
ネスで勝
right,
てるよう
we
な
are
企業群に
looking
よる
at
ステークホルダーを巻き込ん
the
での社
mission
会経
of
済システム
GX
の変革
League,
が必要という
which
こと
is
が
to
言われ
have
ております。
transformation
そ
of
のために積
socio-economic
極的に取り
system
組む
as
企
a
業群
whole.
が
And then we have a
産
group of
学
companies
金融
that
の
are
金
going to
で
be working
GX
together
に向け
with the
た挑戦を
academia,
行うプレイ
government,
ヤー
as
とと
well
も
as
に
the
一体とし
financial
て経済社会システム全
industry
体の変革のための議論
to
と市場の創造のための実
induce
践を行う場として
discussions
設立するとあります。
about the
長く
socio-economic
なりましたけれ
system
ども、
transformation and
2022
creation
年
of
は
the market.
440社のさまざまな業態
In
規模の会社さんか
2022,
ら賛同を受け
440
て、産業
companies
企業数
took
は
part in
そ
GX
の後増え
League
て、
from a
今
variety
年
of
の1月現在
industries.
で
And then as of
679社、
January of
日
this
本
year,
全体の
the
国
number
内の
of the
排出の
companies
4
has
割をカバ
increased
ー
to
すると言われております。
679, which covers 40% of the
2022年度
emissions
の
in
GX リー
Japan.
ズの
And the
活
GX
動につい
League
て
in
は右下の図でお
2022
示ししておりますけれ
activities
ども、
are
参加企
explained
業の募
right
集、
hand
実証の
side
ルールの策
at the
定、
bottom.
東証のインフラを活用し
We
た経産省の
solicited
委託に
more
よる
participation and
実
we
証実験が
formulated
行
the
われま
rules
し
for
た。
the demonstration and actual
次のスライドに
demonstration
参りま
act
す。
took
こ
place
こでそもそもの話
in
と
the
なりま
Tokyo
すけれども、
Stock
GX
Exchange, which
リーグ
was
の基本構想についてお話を
J
させていただ
credit
きます。
trading.
左
So
側、
this is
右
the
側の
basic
図をご
concept
覧
of
ください。
GX League.
循環
As you
構
can
造という
see
のが
from the
ここで
right
のキー
hand
ワードです
side,
けれども、それ
here
を起
the
こしていく
circular
中では、
economy
企
is
業
the
の意
key
識
word.
行動の
In
変
order
容、
to induce
それから
circular
生
economy, we
活者、
need
市
to
民の
have
意
the
識
change
行
in
動
the
変容
attitude
の
and
それぞれが
behavior
必要である
among
ということであります。
the not only
ま
the
た、脱
companies
炭素
but
化の中で生
also
まれた
among
新しい
the
価値につい
people.
て、そ
And
こ
then
に
the
価値を見
value
出して
created
対価を払ってくれ
needs to be
る、そういう
appreciated
認識が
and
社会全体に
consumers
進ん
need
で
to
い
be
くことが
able
必要
to
という
pay
こと
for
でありま
that.
す。
So
その
that
ために、
understanding needs
こう
to
い
be
った
formed
産
formed
官
in the
学
society as a
の連
whole.
携を持っ
And
て、
for that, we have a
それぞれに
collaboration among
共
the
同作業をしたり、
academia,
デ
the
ィ
government,
スカッ
and
ション
the
を交わし
private
たりといった
sector.
形
And
で、
they collaborate,
新しい
they
世の中を
discuss
作っていくという
to
こと
create
が
a
目論まれ
new
ているところであ
society.
りま
And
す。
that is what we aim for in
次の
GX
スライドに参
League.
ります。
Next slide,
こ
please.
こでは排出の量を調
Here
整する仕組
we
みと
are
して、
looking at the mechanism
GX リ
to
ーグの役
adjust
割を果た
the
せていただいております。
emissions amount and
右
what
側
kind
の
of role
図の、
role
図
a
の中の
GX
左側が足元の
League
取り組みに
is
なりまして、右に
playing.
行くと2050年に向け
And
ての量
from
を
the
調整する
left
仕組みという
bottom
と
to
こ
the
ろを描い
right
ておりま
upper
す。
hand
後
side,
で詳し
we
く
are
触れます
looking
けれど
at
も、
the
排出量
mechanism
の取
to
引につ
make
い
the
ては3
adjustment
段階
of
に分
the
けて、
emission volume.
実証、そ
And
れ
then
か
as
ら
for the
進化を
trading, we
行
have
って
three
まいり
steps.
ます。
We have the demonstration and we have the evolution of the system. And what has to be careful is that it's not just the emissions trading, but also subsidies and also tax systems as well as the regulations need to be enhanced. So all of these need to be incorporated in one package.
さて、GX リーグですけれ
So
ども、
next,
GX リー
GXB
グは
takes certain initiatives.
賛同した民間企業による自主的な取り組みの場で、
So
この
this is a
場では
voluntary
大きく3つ
body
のことが
of
取り組まれていま
private
す。
sector companies, and
2050
there are
年
three
カーボンニュー
things.
トラルのサステナ
One
ブルな
is
未来像を議
sustainable
論、
future
創
vision
造
for
する場。
2050 carbon
2番目は
neutrality, and
カー
it's
ボ
a
ンニュートラ
forum
ル時
for
代の市場
discussing
の
that,
創造
for
やルールメイ
creating
キングを議
such
論
a
する場。
future. The
3番目
second
とし
is
て、
that
自ら
GX
掲げた
League
目
is a
標に
forum
向け
for
て自主
discussing
的な
market
排出量
creation
取
and
引を行う
rulemaking in the
ト
carbon
レードの場、
neutral
この
era.
3つ
And
でござい
then
ます。
it is
でこれ
also
ら
a
のそれぞれ
forum
がワーキンググル
where
ープ等の
voluntary
形を
emissions
通して行
trading
わ
is
れている
carried
とござい
out
ま
to
す。
meet self-imposed
3
targets,
つの
and
取り組みの
these
中の
three
2番目
initiatives
に
are being
カーボンニ
undertaken
ュ
in
ー
the
トラル時
form
代
of
の市場創
working
造ル
groups.
ールやルールメイ
And
キン
then
グを
the
議論
second
する場
one
というのがあ
is
りました。
to
こ
discuss
れにつきましては
the
2023
market
年3
creation
月
and
31日
rulemaking
に
in the carbon
GX
neutral
計測
era.
審ワーキンググループ
And
での
then
議論を踏まえた成果物と
GX
して気候関連の機会における開示、
disclosure
評価の基本方針というのが公表さ
assessment,
れています。
excuse me, basic
ここで
guidelines for
は気候
disclosure
関
and
連の機
assessment
会
in
の適切な開
climate-related
示、評価の前
opportunities
提
were
となる基
published
本的な考え
as
方
an
をまとめた
outcome
もの
of the
が述
discussion
べ
in
ら
the
れておりま
GX
す。
management
2
promotion
章から構
working
成さ
group,
れ、1
and the
章は気
basic
候関連の機
concepts
会
are
についての定
described.
義、
And
重
the
要性をま
first,
とめ、
there
例
is
示
a
とともに
definition
示
of
しています。
climate-related
2
opportunities,
章のとこ
and
ろで
there are
は、
summaries of their
気候関
importance.
連の機会を示す
And then
一
in
例
the
として、
second
製品、
chapter,
サービスを使用することで、社会全体の排出
using
削
a
減にどれだ
product
け
and
寄与したかを表
services,
す削
how
減貢献量を
much
取り上げています。
avoided
削
emissions
減
can
貢
be
献量につ
realized.
いて、
This
そ
is a
の開示にあた
contribution
って
to
の
the
考え方
emission
指針、これは
reductions
企業
in
側、
the
あるい
society.
は評価
And
に
then
あ
the
たっての考え方
disclosure,
指針、これは金融機
policy
関、
and
投資家側
guidelines
の
and
話になりますが、
evaluation
これをまとめたものとなっています。
approach and guidelines
ここ
are
は
also
先ほどのシルバニ
contained,
アさ
and
ん
the
の
disclosure
お話と
policy
も
and
少し
guidelines are
関
for
連するところ
companies
であ
and
ります。
evaluation approach and guidelines
さ
are
て、
for
具
the
体的な内容としては、推
financial
奨される開示内
institutions,
容
and
と
this
して、
overlaps
この
with what
表のような
Silvana
形
spoke
でまと
about.
められてい
And
ます
then
が、
these are the
まだまだ
recommendations that are
今後
put
の
together in
議
the
論、
format of the table.
実
But
例
then a
の積み
future
重ねによっ
discussion
て
may
進化がして
lead
いくというような
to
ことが
the
書か
evolution
れておりま
of
す。
those
今後将来、
guidelines
議論を重
going
ねていくこと
forward,
で、
and
更
we
新
will
を
be
必要によって
accumulating
行
more
うということが書か
demonstration
れ
and
ています。
experiences, and this table is going to be
3つ目の取
updated
り組みの
going
3番
forward.
目ですけれども、
And
自
the
主的な
third
排出量取引
initiative
について
is
は、昨
about
年度の活動
voluntary
として、9
trading.
月下
And
旬から
last
今
year,
年1
from
月までの
September
間、
until
東証に
January
おい
of
てカー
this
ボンクレ
year,
ジット市
in the
場の
Tokyo
技術
Stock
的実証
Exchange,
実験
the
が
demonstration
経産省の
of
委
the
託によっ
carbon
て行
credit
われました。
market was actually
ここでは民
conducted
間の
with the
事業
commission
者によ
of
っ
the
て多くの
Ministry
取引
of
がされている
Economy.
J クレジッ
J
トから実
credits
証が開
have
始され
been
ております。
already traded by
約
many
80
private
日間、
sector
今日の営業日の間
corporations.
に
And then J credits
163
were
件の約
traded
15万
with
トン CO2 相当
163
の取引が
contracts,
行われ、
and
クレジットの金額としては3
150,000
億円
tons
の
of
商いが
CO2
なされ
equivalent
ました。
credits
実
were
験ですので、
traded
プロジェクト
that
に
was
紐づいた
worth
ものとしての売買
approximately
ではなく、
300 million
当社は
yen
64種類
that
ある
was
方法論、
traded.
あるいは方
And
法
then
論体系
64
7部類の中から選んで
methodologies
取引をするルールでし
and
た。
also
また
7
11月
categories
か
of
ら
the
は試みと
methodologies
して
were
政府が保
used
有す
because
る
it
J
was
クレジッ
just
ト
an
の販売、
experiment. And
ま
the
た
J
参加者の意
credits
見を踏
are
まえ
being
た売
traded,
買区分の見直しなどを行う
and those J
取り組み
credits
が
are
行われ
held
ま
by
し
the
た。
government were
クレジット
also
の活用用
traded.
途に応じた6種類に変更して、
And the
簡素化
categories
し、
were
標準化
changed
を
to
図って
6.
流動性の向上を意図した
And now
取り組み
it's
であり
more
ました。
simplified
また、
in
超
order
過
to
削減
improve
枠
the
については
liquidity
まだ
in the
存在してお
market.
りませんので、
And then
模擬的な
excess
売買
reduction
がここで施
allowance
行さ
was
れたと
not
言われ
yet
てい
in
ます。
existence, therefore only simulated
さて、
trading
今年度
was
2023
carried
年の
out.
活動につい
And
て
as
明らかに
for
なってい
the
るところ
fiscal
は、
year
こちらの図
2023,
のようになっ
what
てお
is
ります。
already known
今
is
年の秋には
shown in
GX ダ
this
ッシュボードを
slide.
公開するというところで、そ
So
の
this
中
fall
で
GX
各企業、
dashboard will be
排出量の
publicized,
目
and
標を各社
under
設
the
定して
dashboard,
明らか
each
にします。
company will set
また、
a target for
2024年
emission.
9月以降になり
And
ますけ
after
れども、
September 2024,
2023年度、
the
今年度
emission
の排出量
results
実
for
績を
2023
計
will
測し
be
て報告
reported.
し、ダッシュボード上で
And under the
自主的
dashboard,
な目標の達成
the
状況、あ
achievement
るいは
rate
排出
status
量
of
取
the
引の状
target
況
and
を公
also
開
the
することに
status
な
of
ります。
emission trading will be
来年の
publicized.
夏以降に
And after the
2023
summer
年度
next
の目標
year,
に対する
the
実績が分か
results
りますの
against
で、
the
ここ
target
から
for
超過
2023 will
削
be
減
known.
枠というものが生ま
That
れてき
means
ま
that
す。
excess reduction allowance will be generated from that.
排出量取引について詳
When
し
it
く
comes
触
to
れ
the
させていた
emission
だきま
trade,
す。
this is more
参
in
加企
detail.
業は基準年
The
度を設定
participating
して、
company
基
will
準
set
年度
a
の排出量
baseline
を算定、
fiscal
報
year
告する
and
ことにな
calculate
り
and
ます。
report the
注
emission
意が
amount
必要
for
なのは
the year.
NDC、国が
And
国
the
際公約として掲げ
NDC
た目
for
標
Japan
と
is a
整合的であると
46%
いうことが
reduction
求め
until
られます。
2030. So the company's
例示であ
goal
りま
should
す
be
よう
in
に、
line with
左
that.
側の例示
As
は
shown
超
as
過達成
example
した
on
場
the
合を
left
示
hand
しておりま
side,
すけれど
this
も、
is a
自主
case
目
where
標を
the
上回る、プラス
reduction was
国の
made.
目標も
And
満
the
たしているということが超
NDC
過枠の
also
設
needs
定に必要にな
to
ります。
be
他
taken
方、
account
真ん中
for
の絵は
calculating the excess
未達の
reduction
場合ですけれども、
allowance.
目標を達成
And
して
when
も、
the
国の
goal
目標を
is
達
not
成していない場合、あるいは両方とも未達の場合は、
when the
未達という状
NDC
況
and
に
the
なります。
company goal are not achieved, then the
今後の
excess reduction allowance will
GXETS
be
の
not
発展のイメー
generated.
ジです。
And this is
今年度、
the
第1フェー
image
ズのと
for
こ
the
ろで
future
は、比較的
evolution.
緩やかな
And
自
the
主的な
first
ところの
phase
取り
will be
組み
more
ということが
relaxed
なされて
and
おりまし
voluntary
て、
activity.
自らの目
will be
標設定と、
focused.
それから
And
開示というのがルールになりますが、
the rule
第
will
2フェ
be
ーズ、
setting
2026 年
goal
頃から
and disclosure
2032年ぐらいまでの
in
間
a
に入っていき
budget
ますと、
process.
施行から本格
But
的
as
稼
a
働とい
second
う
phase from
位置づけでステージがアッ
2026 to
プします。
2032,
ま
the
たこ
stage
こ
will
で
be
は
up
民
for
間第三者
full-fledged
機関の認証
operation.
等の仕組みも入って
Under
きます
that,
ので、
the
かなり
third body,
厳しい
private
仕組みにな
sector
ってくる
third
ものと思い
body
ます。
certification
ま
will
た
be
第3ステージ
incorporated.
のところでは、
So practice will become more strict. In the third
発電
phase,
部門について取り組むことによって、場合によってはオークションの割り当てとか有償化で
will
さ
be
らに
included, and
カバレッジを
the
広げていくということになります。
auction may be included
次
to
に2番
enhance
目
the
の課
other
題でありま
coverage.
す GX 推進
And
の
the
法につ
second
いて
is
簡
with
潔に
regards
説
to
明
the
していた
GX
だきます。
promotion law.
この法律は
So
脱
this
炭素
law
成
is
長型
to
経
do
済
with the
すなわち産
decarbonization
業活動に
growth
おいて使用
economy,
するエネルギー及び原材料
meaning
にかかる二
that
酸化
the
炭素を原則
economic
として大気中
structure
に排出
allowing
せずに
economic growth
産業協
by
力を強化し
strengthening
経済成長
industrial
を行っていくという
competition
こと
without
に
emitting the carbon
力点が置
dioxide
かれてい
to
ます。
atmosphere
こ
will
れ
be
ま
the
でエネ
focus.
ルギーの安定供給の
So
確保
far,
が大前提でありま
conventionally,
したが、
energy
それに
supply
加え
in
て
stable
成長
manner
志向
was
型
the
のカーボンプ
prerequisite.
ライシ
But
ン
in
グの
addition to that,
実現、実
with
行
the
によって
realization
加
and
速していこ
execution
うと
of
いう
the
ものであります。
growth-oriented carbon
また、ここ
pricing,
で書かれておりますように、
the
今後、
acceleration
官
of
民への
GX
必要
and
な
the
投資額は
industrial
150兆
competitiveness,
円を
a
超えると
strengthening
試
of
算され
Japanese
ておりますけれ
economy
ど
and
も、そ
the
のうちの
economic
約
growth will
20
be
兆円
intended.
を GX
And
移行
for
債の
10
発行
years,
で
the
支援
needed
し、民間
investment
における
from between the private
設
and
備
public
投資に
sectors
関わ
is
る意思
calculated
決
to be
定を
150 trillion
後ろから
yen,
サポートしようという
but
も
the
のであ
20
ります。
trillion yen will be covered by issuance
こ
of
ち
the
らの方は
GX
GX 実
transition
現に向け
bond.
た基本方針の
And
概要で、
this
後
is the
ほどお時間があ
overview
るところ
of
に
the
時にご
basic
覧いただければ幸いですが、
policy for
一気に触れ
realizing
させていただ
GX.
きます
Please
と、この
refer
右
to
下
this
の方
later.
に、
If you look
社
at the right
会
bottom
のところにつ
side,
いて簡潔に触れ
there
た
is
と
a
ころがあり
section
ます。
for society.
実はここで、カーボンフットプリントと
Under
関係
here,
があるところがありま
there
す。
is a item related to
2023年の
carbon
3
footprint.
月に、経
In the
産省
March
並びに環
2030,
境省か
the
ら
METI
日
and
本
the Ministry
の
of
カーボン
Environment
フットプリント
Japan
についてのガイドラインが公表されております。
was
その中で
released
関
a
連するの
guideline
は
for
この部
carbon
分でありまして、
footprint.
こうい
And
っ
this
た
section is
脱
related
炭素
to
化を
the
加速していく
guideline.
中での
So
市
in
民
accelerating
社会、
decarbonization,
市民
the
社会
civil
の理解を
society
いかに醸成していくかという
understanding
ところ
is
とかかってい
required
ると
and
ころ、ま
how
た
to
シルバニア
enhance
さん、
such
ヒューさんから
understanding
プレ
is
ゼンがあった
related.
ところと
And
関連があるとこ
also
ろでありま
this
す。
item is related to
こちら
what
は
was
今後10
presented
年
by
を見
Hughes
据え
and
た
Silvana さん。
ロードマップの全
And
体
this
像
is the
です。
overview of the roadmap for coming 10 years.
最後に、
And
日
lastly,
本の現在の位置づけについて
Japan's
ちょっと触れてみ
current
たいと思います。
status is what
日
I'd like
本
to
のカーボ
mention
ンプライ
now.
スはこのグ
The
ラフで
carbon
見る
price
と
in
左側に
Japan
位置しており
is
まし
on
て、
the
かな
left
り
hand
安いと
side
ころ
in
にあ
this
りま
chart.
す。
So the
渡航
price
諸
is
国
quite
の取り
low.
組みが世界的には早かったことに
North
向けて、
European
欧州
countries
諸国
were
はか
ahead
な
of
り
other
高い価格
countries,
帯、
but
右側に位置
those
している
European
ことが
countries
分かり
are
ます。
with the higher price range
ま
on the
た、
right hand
ドル
side.
表示ですけれど
And
も、主要
also,
な
this is shown on the
ETS 市場にお
dollar-based
ける価
dollar
格の
basis,
推移を表し
but
てお
the
りま
price
す。
change of the major ETS
戦
market
争
is
であると
presented
か、
here.
経済危機によって
When
価
there
格が下
are
落すること
wars
もありま
and
すけ
the
れども、
financial crisis,
ヨーロ
they
ッパの
impact
ETS を見
the
ますと、過去
overall
の改
prices.
革を通じて、
But
右肩上
when
が
we
り
look at the
でクレジッ
ETS
トの価
market
格が上
in
がってき
Europe,
ました。
overall,
こうした
the
動き
price
は
has been
今後の日本
increasing
の先
steadily
行きを見る上でも参考
despite
になるの
those
ではないかと
events.
思います。
Those
ま
are
た、
the
こちらで論
information
じ
we
られてい
can
るところ
learn
は、
in developing
EU
a system in
ETS を
Japan.
そ
And
と
what
し
is
て海
described
外の経
here
験からの
are
教
the
訓であ
lessons
ります。
learned from
これ
overseas
らの多くの点につ
experiences.
いてはすでに
And with regards
日
to
本
those
政府あるいは
lessons,
GX リーグ関
they
係者
have
の間で
already been
認識されて
recognized
お
by
り、
Japanese
今
government
後
and
のカーボ
stakeholders
ン
to
クレジットの適
GX
切な活用の
leagues.
ための環境整
And
備、あるい
those
は議論の
lessons
中
will
で、
be leveraged in
明らかに
developing
なってくる
environment
部分
for
があるのであろう
usage
と
of
思いま
carbon
す。
credit and such.
最後になりますけれども、クラス NK
Lastly,
はゼロエミ
Class
サポート
NK
サービス、あ
is
るいは J
providing
ク
a
レジット
zero
の
emission support
審査機関
service
とし
and
て、
also
皆様の
working
脱
as
炭素
a
化に向け
evaluation
た取り組みをお手伝いしており
organization
ます。同
for for
冒頭に今日
J.
の
Craig.
テーマは、つながろうということであ
And
ると申し上げましたけれども、
topic I
国内
said
のい
is
ろんな
to
関係者が
link
つなが
our
るというこ
work
と、
together
それ
with
から
different
今日、
stakeholders.
ロンドンからご参加
And
いた
what
だ
I
きま
mean
した
by
が、
that is to
海
work
外の方ともつながることによって、
in
先
collaboration
端
with
の
other
知見を取り入れ
stakeholders
て、
within
非
countries,
常に大きな課題である
within
脱
Japan
炭
and
素
also
化に向けて、
internationally, like we have a
NHK と
speaker
しても
today
進んでいくことを
from
記念して
overseas.
私の話
And
を終わらせていただ
wishing
きます。あり
the
がとうございまし
development
た。
going forward, I'd like to close my speech. Thank you, presentation. Thank you very much.
それではこれより
DXD.
お時間許す限り
So from
ご
now
講演に
on,
関する Q&A のセクションに入らせ
We'd
ていた
like
だ
to
きま
have
す。
the Q&A
こちらのセクション
session.
より山口様にバ
And
トンタッ
from
チさ
here,
せて
I'd
いた
like
だ
to
きま
give
す。
the
山口
microphone
様よろしくお
over
願いいたし
to
ます。
Mr. Yamaguchi.
Thank
Thank
それでは
you.
Q&A のセッション
So
は
let's
私と本田さん
get
東京の方で
started with
で
Q&A session.
シルバーナと
Myself
ヒュ
and
ー
Honda-san
はオンに
taking
入れま
part
すか
from Tokyo and Silvana
カ
and
メラオン
Hugh.
ですかね今
Can you turn on your
ぜひ
camera?
Hello
Yes, both
Oh
of
yes
you.
Hugh
Thank you.
Hello Silvana please Okay great はい それではまあ
Right.
ちょっとだい
Okay.
ぶ時間
So
もしては
let's
おり
get
ますの
started.
で、
We are running out of time.
駆け足になってしまいますけど、まずちょっと質問が入っているので、こちら
So
私の方から
I think
シルバード
we
ヒュー
have a
に質問したいと思い
question
ますけど、
coming in from the
ス
audience.
ライド25
So
等
this is
で
about
カーボンニュートラル
slide
フットプリント
25,
のマークのことが
and
出てま
it's
すけど、
about
これは
carbon
フットプリ
footprint
ント
mark or
の
label.
ラベリングにはですね、
And
いろんな
this
種類とか
label,
等
does
級
it
と
have
か存
different
在するんです
grades
か？
or different
単純な
types?
質問ですけど、
It's a very
お
simple
願いしま
question.
す。
I think I'll respond that one. It doesn't have different marks. So the label, it looks the same in terms of the architecture for any of our clients who have achieved neutrality. For us, it is important that we have done a lot of consumer research on the label and what it communicates. So the architecture in terms of the design is the same, but as you can see next to it, there is a text box. And in that text box is where we encourage clients to be transparent on what they have achieved and what they have done to get to that level. And that is quite important to communicate and be transparent on what that label means and what is associated with in terms of your product. But there is no different grades in terms of gold or silver. No, it is all of our clients achieve go through the same process, and it's through that text box that they explain to consumers what they have achieved.
了解です。ありがとうございます。そうですね。ほとんど
Thank you very
の出たところをリピートしていただくことになっちゃいましたけど、ありがとうございました。
So thank you very much.
それでもう一個いきましょうか。
So
ニュ
another
ートラルの
question.
認証においてカー
So
ボン
in
トラスト
carbon
として、
neutral
推奨したいこと、
certification,
もしくは強
what
調
would
したい
you
こ
like
と、
to recommend or
特にその
emphasize
グリーンウォッ
as
シ
a
ュ
carbon
などに
trust?
対しての
Well,
対
you
応策
talked
として
about
どん
the
なふうなことを
greenwash,
考えていらっ
but
しゃる
what
か
can be the
解説
measures
いただければ。
against such problems? Could you explain?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. You go first, Simone, and then I'll add in.
Yeah, thank you. So the most important for us as a mission-driven organization, the key part for us is the demonstration of reductions, and for clients who achieve neutrality, that is a key part of the neutrality. It is to demonstrate reductions and demonstrate reductions every year at recertification, and offset those reductions that they cannot be reduced. When they communicate their footprint, it is important, and as you mentioned, there is a lot of scrutiny with green claims. So it is important that the clients are factual. And when they are communicating their footprinting results, they have all of the claims, and we recommend clients, they have to be truthful and accurate. They have to be clear. We recommend clients not to omit important information and provide relevant information to their clients. All of the claims must be as well fair and meaningful, and then everything should be substantiated with evidence. And then there is green codes that are being developed at UK level, different countries in the Europe, as well in the United States in the near future, and at European level as well. And we work with clients to follow those green codes that are being developed. Yeah, Hugh, over to you.
Yeah, no, just to say that it's all about disclosure, and that increasingly, with our label, we are looking for underlying claims which emphasize the reduction, because we think a reduction is a much safer claim for an organization to make than just offsetting.
ありがとうございました。そうですね。やはりエビデンスのベースに基づいて。
Thank you very much. So it has to be evidence-based.
当然のことですけど、ありがとう
Yes,
ござ
of
いま
course.
す。メモしていただいたと思います。
It's only natural and it's
それでちょっ
taken
と
for granted.
本田
Thank
さん
you
の方
very
に
much.
ご質問を振り
So
たいと
now
思い
I
ます
have
けど、
some questions to
日
Honda
本のクレジット市場についてもお
Japan's
話しいただ
credit
きましたけども、
market. That's
今
something you
後
have
のその J
explained to
リーグ
us.
の中で J クレジットとか JCM とか、
Within
すでにスタートさ
GXL
れているも
League,
のを、またその
J
他の
credit
ボランタリ
market
ークレ
has
ジットの
already
この
started,
取
and
引
there
が
are
どの
other
ような展開
voluntary
をされ
credit
るか、
trading think this is taking place going forward? What is the prospect and outlook? Yes, in the working group within the GX League, this is exactly the topic to be discussed. So JCM and J Credit have been recognized already, but there are other credit schemes that can benefit the economy of Japan overall. So J Blue Credit is one, or negative emission removal technology-based credits. For instance, as Hugh spoke about, DAC, DAC, direct air capture of CO2, or BECS, biomass with CCS to kind of store CO2 in soil. And the J Blue credit is something that I touched upon in the presentation. And the blue credit trading has already started. It's 70,000 to 80,000 yen per ton. That's around 20 times higher price than usual credit.
そういう意味ではいわゆる除去型ですね。排出除去型の部分もマーケットとして出てきているということで、そういう意味では一歩日本も先を行けるのかなというところかなと思います。それでは本田さんの方にお移りして、本田さんからもしヒューとか質問ご質問あれば。
フットプリントについてのカーボントラストの取り組み、非常に興味深いと思うんですけども、具体的な製品とかいろいろご紹介いただいたんですが、金融サービスのような無形のものについてもカーボンフットプリントの認証は与えられるんでしょうか。
Well, Silvana, I might defer to you, but just to say, in principle, a service can be footprinted, just as a product can be footprinted. But and we have had cases where we've looked at, for example, the footprint of a telephone call. We provided that, and we provided the certification. But in general, this is particularly for business to consumer communications. This is generally, we're finding that it's physical products which organizations want to certainly to label. Silvana, would you add anything to that?
No, it's just that in the majority of our clients, they are physical consumer goods. And but then we have over the years done services as well, as you mentioned. We have worked with telecom companies to certify the footprint and certified data. Oh, sorry, the footprint of making a phone call, sending text messages as well. We have recently done a mortgage, the footprint of providing a mortgage. So it is possible. But it is, I will say, the majority of our clients are for more tangible products than services.
ありがとうございます。もう一問、フットプリントのところで、
So another thing about footprinting, I'm looking at slide number 15. A cradle to gate versus cradle to grave. So there are two boundaries. And the METI in Japan and the Ministry of the Environment of Japan issued the guidelines. And for the finished product, it has to be cradle to grave. And then for intermediates, it could be cradle to gate. So at Carbon Trust, how do you distinguish the two?
Yeah. It is very similar to what you just said. So I like to use the example of sugar. So if it is a sugar company that sells the sugar to Nestle, for example, because that sugar is incorporated into a cookie, then the approach for that sugar is cradle to gate, because then that product gets incorporated into another one. So then the footprinting responsibility, then it will be from that other company for the end of life. But if that sugar company then puts the sugar inside a bag and they sell it in a retailer, let's say Walmart, Carrefour, then the approach for that footprinting analysis will be cradle to grave, because it is a product with consumer facing. So it is very similar to what you just said. Yes, and we sit down with each client to understand what will be the right approach. But if it's an intermediary product, cradle to gate. If it is a final consumer product, will be cradle to grave.
ありがとうございます。最後に私から山口さんにちょっとご質問なんですけれども、京都議定書ができた時代からトレードに関与、確か投資銀行でトレードに関与されてたと思うんですけれども、その辺のご経験から今後のマーケットについてどのようにお考えか、もしコメントいただけたら。はい、
ご質問ありがとうございます。そうですね、当時、そういうそのコモディティのトレードの一端として、排出権のトレードしておりましたけど、そうですね、クレジット、まずトレードっていう面から入っていくと、最も重要な意味は皆さんの、本田さんのプレゼンにも入ってましたけど、カーボンのですね、市場価格が見えると、そこがもう一番大事なことだと思いますので、で、その価格が上がっていくことによってですね、企業の脱炭素イノベーションを生み出しますし、その脱炭素の行動を促すことだと思いますけど、ただこれはやはり要は市場の設定をですね、しっかりしていかないと、なかなか正当なプライスにならないというのが、京都の実験だったと思います。で、特にその京都の時によく聞いた話ですけども、あれキャップアンドトレード、キャップを与えられるんですけど、その東の諸国などは当時非常に余裕のあるですね、寛容なキャップがあるので、ほとんどその省エネの努力なくですね、余ったキャップを市場に出して、それをその軍事費に当てるとですね、そういったケースについて、供給サイドのそのモラルハザードというんでしょうかね、そういうことで市場が崩れた一つの一因だと思いますし、そういうその市場設定、大事だと思います。で、最近のクレジット市場はその、ボランタリーで、二国間とかですね、自己発生的に必然性から生まれてきているので、その余裕があるようなキャップから出てきてはいないので、その部分は少し改善してくると思いますけど、一方で多分気になるのは、スコープ3なんかはですね、先ほど申し上げたように、非常にその算定手法もまだ標準化されてないので、京都の時代はスコープ1、2、だけでしたけど、今そのスコープ3の重要性が言われる中で、じゃあその算定手法がはっきりしないスコープ3をセットするのと、1、2をセットする、これは同じでいいのかっていう問題とかです。また排出除去型の排出削減とその排出低減型っていうか、再生可能エネルギーみたいな。これもやはり多分まだまだそのコストにものすごい開きがあると思いますので、そういったものを一緒に取引できるのか、別にこの辺がキーで、先ほども日本のマーケットというと、排出除去型についても別のマーケットができているというのは、非常に明るい見通しのような気がいたします。ありがとうございます。それじゃあ、質問引き取って最後になりますけど、ロンドンチームに。
Finally, I have one last question to the London team. So in terms of carbon neutrality, this is a kind of the one-time point on the trajectory towards net zero. And I think there have been some concerns about carbon neutrality. So what is the future of carbon neutrality in your mind?
Yes, you're right. There have been a number of questions about carbon neutrality communications and about some offsets. There's been articles, quite serious allegations in the press, and there's even been some court cases and regulation in Europe and some court cases in America. So this is clearly it's increasing as an area of confusion and perceived potential greenwash for organizations. So we would say that while there is still a legitimate place for good quality offsetting, a much stronger approach is probably required, which uses net zero as the key activity of a company. In other words, the steep reduction that's required for the net zero trajectory, and that really is given priority over carbon neutral. We would advise companies now against relying only on carbon neutral for their sustainability claims. Does that answer your question?
Yes, そうですね。はい、ありがとうございます。
Yes, thank you very
だいぶ
much.
ちょっと時間もしてしまいましたけど。
So I think we've passed time already. So Honda-san, one final
はい、
comment.
それでは皆さん
Okay.
長時間ありがとうご
So
ざいました。
everyone, thank you very much
登壇者の皆さんも
for
本
your
当にあり
time
がとうございます。あ、そうです。
as
最
the
後は
speakers
時間に振ります
and the
から
participants. Thank you.
それでは司会の方に
Yes, I'd like
どうもありがとう
to
ございました。
hand over back to the moderator. Thank you.